"Help!" is what I yelled from my parents' woods when I was, I guess, just about 10 years old. That day started off sort of like most any other summer day for a 10-year-old boy. I was outside playing, probably mainly because my parents made me go outside because they didn't want me in the house, so they could have a little peace of mind. But at any rate, I'm outside and I'm playing and doing what I do normally, and that's, you know, throwing stones and shooting a basketball and getting in trouble with the neighbor. That's right, getting in trouble with the neighbor. And I remember on this particular day, the neighbor boy had harassed me pretty well, and he was about 2 years older than me. And I remember taking a golf club and hitting him in the shins with it, and I sent him home packing. Now, that really wasn't, you know, the Christian thing to do, but I'm 10 years old, and I'm just being a boy. And so I sent that neighbor boy home crying and packing. And I started to walk around the yard and mosey around a little bit and trying to get into some mischief, I guess. And so I decided I was going to go walk into my parents' woods. They own 5 acres of woods. And my mother always told me, "David, don't go back in that woods by yourself." And of course, like a good boy, I didn't listen, you know. So I hit the trail heading back into the woods, and you know, I just started kicking around, and I walked back a little ways, and next thing you know, I decided I'd start looking for maybe a salamander or a turtle. You know, we had quite a bit of those in northwest Ohio, especially in the Black Swamp region. So I started kicking over a few sticks and moving some leaves, and you know, kind of kicking here and there, and maybe moved a few small logs that I could handle. And then came a point in time when I didn't find anything that I just said, well, I give up. And so I turned around and walked back to the trail, and that's when I realized the trail wasn't where I thought it was. And so I began to walk north, I think. I walked this way and walked a little ways and couldn't find a trail, so I turned this way and I walked a ways and couldn't find a trail. Then I went that way and this way, and I went every which way, and I began to panic, and my heart began to race a little bit. And I remember just starting to sob up and to cry, and I can say that to you because you don't know me all that well. Well, maybe you do, but I began to cry, and I got very scared because I didn't know where I was at. I got lost, and I remember at one point I yelled, "Help!" because I was lost. I didn't know how to get back to the house. I was terrified. I yelled, "Help!" again. "Save me! Somebody save me!" That's a good Southern Baptist mentality, right? Save me. Although I had the concept right, it didn't really mean that I wanted to save for salvation purposes, but I just positionally, I didn't know where I was. And I repeated the help me," as I cried a number of times. And at some point, and I can't tell you exactly when, I heard a noise, and I heard some rustle and bustle. Then I heard somebody say, "Where are you?" And I yelled, "Help!" again. And then I seen a few weeds move and a few limbs, and then they parted. And it was the neighbor that I had beat up that morning with the golf club. Well, I know what you're thinking. I'm in big trouble. But fortunately for me that morning, the neighbor boy came in, he grabbed a hold of me, and he walked me back to the trail and out into my parents' yard. And the funny thing is that once we got into my parents' yard, I could swear, and I'm probably wrong, we probably weren't more than 50 feet into the woods. 50 feet into the woods. Can you believe that? I was only 50 feet into the woods and I was lost on my own property. I was lost at home. Lost at home. That's the topic of this series that we're going to be looking over for the next 3 to 4 weeks. It's going to be entitled Lost at Home, where we're going to talk about what it feels like to be in the very place that you're called to be, and yet you seem so distant from it, so separated from it, and the challenges that come along with it, and the blessing and the reality of the hope that we have and the encouragement that we have that we're really not lost, but we are where we are called to be. We're positionally in the right place. Just like at my parents' house, you know, if I could have rose up from my position within that woods, even though I was lost, if I could have rose up to God's elevation per se, maybe 100 feet in the air, I could have seen I was right at home. But I couldn't see from God's position. I couldn't see from overhead. I could only see forward and around me. And it was summertime, and so all the bushes were in full bloom. Everything was really weeded out. There was, leaves on everything, and the briars were going on. And so I couldn't see anything. I couldn't see more than probably 10 feet in front of me. If I could see at 50 feet, I would have seen my parents' property and their house. And there's a railroad track that ran along the south side of our property, and if I could have had a little bit of a clearing, I could have at least seen the high-power wires that ran along the railroad track. But as it was, I was on my own property at home, and I was lost. Now, isn't that really a weird concept, though? I mean, think about to be lost at home. Maybe not as weird as you think. You know, because when you think about home, we think about it really as an address. For instance, with me, I would tell people that were local that knew me, they'd say, "Where do you live, Pastor Dave?" And I'd say, "Well, I live at such and such an address on such a street. That's my home." Okay? And for some people that maybe I met out of town, they'd say, "What city do you live in, Pastor Dave?" And I'd say, "Well, I live in the greater Toledo area. That's my home." And for some people, when I would be out of state traveling on my secular job, they would say, "Where do you live?" I'd say, "Ohio," because the state of Ohio is my home. I say, "I live in Ohio," because people could recognize that as my home much easier than they could my address. So really, what is my home? Well, America is my home. The Western Hemisphere is my home. The planet Earth is my home, right? This solar system in which we exist is our home. And the very universe in which I stand is my home. That's a big picture of home. And now you can see how I got lost. Such a small person in such a big home. And the funny thing again is that I knew I was at home. I was on my own property, but I wasn't going to be satisfied until the weeds of life, until the trees of life, until the brush of life was separated from before me, and so that I could see verifiably that I was in the place that I was called to be. At that point, and then I would have nothing to worry about. I mean, that happens to us, right? We think about that. Maybe it's happened to you. I know it's happened to me. I'm not afraid to admit things, but I'll get in the zone sometimes, and I'll get to the end of my driveway, and I can't decide whether I should go to the left or right, because I kind of, for a moment, I forget exactly where I'm going and what the best route to get there is. Or how about that moment at the big superstore, right? How about Walmart? We've all been down that road. We went into the pharmacy entrance, right? And then we check out at the food side. And the next thing you know, we come out. And we knew we parked right across from the doors. The problem is we went out a different set of doors. And so all of a sudden, we're walking around Walmart, hitting our panic button on our keys, right? Trying to find out which car is ours. And at the same time, you don't want everyone to know what's happening in your life. How can we really be lost at home in a place we grew up in our whole life? Okay? How can we get lost in a supermarket parking lot when it's limited in size and we check where we park before we go into the store? How can we have such an awareness of our surroundings yet be lost? Reminds me of a story that I heard, a real funny story. Again, I heard this, and it's not original to me. It was a story of a newlywed couple down in the hills of Kentucky. They got married, and for their wedding anniversary, their first wedding anniversary, they had planned to take a hike through the southern Appalachian Mountains in Kentucky. And so they decided they would hire the best mountain tour guide in the state of Kentucky to take them on this tour. So number one, they could see all the sights of the Appalachian Mountains, and number two, so they wouldn't get lost, because that's a vast wilderness area and very mountainous terrain, and they didn't want to get lost. So when their first anniversary came, they took this mountain guide from Kentucky, and they met him, and they took off on this journey through the Appalachian Mountains, all through the southern part of Kentucky. And at some point during the hike, the woman, and it's always the woman that catches this, they got a great eye for understanding when things are going a little bit wrong. The woman noticed that the tour guide kind of looked around and stared in the air a lot, and then scratching his chin as if there was a problem, but then he would just kind of pick up and start walking again. So she shrugged it off and thought, hey, it's just coincidence or whatever. I worry too much. We're okay. And then a little while later again, the guide kind of did the same thing. Only he put his hands on his hips, and he kind of gave that little number to the stars. And he shook his head a little bit, scratched his chin, and he took a right, and they started walking some more through the woods. This happened 3 or 4 times altogether. And finally, on the 5th time, the woman said, Sir? And he said, yes, ma'am. She said, I got to ask you a question. I don't want you to be offended, because I know you're the best mountain guide in the state of Kentucky, but I just can't help but to notice there come times when you almost appear that you're lost or don't know where you're at. And I just want to ask, bluntly, are we lost? And the guide sat down on a stone, and his face fell into his hands, and he started to sob. And he said, ma'am, I'm afraid we're lost. And the woman said, lost? How can this be? We paid good money for you. You are the best mountain guide in the state of Kentucky. How can we be lost? And he said, well, that's the problem, ma'am. I think we're in Tennessee now.